Hello and welcome to Original Soundchat, where video game music is a work of art. On each episode, it's our goal to help you learn about two soundtracks from the world of games, as well as the people, stories, and critical tracks behind them. My name is Joe DeVader.
And I'm Peter Spezia. We're brought to you by Anonymous Dinosaur and Rhymes with Asia. It's time to appreciate great OSTs and the games they come from without getting too bogged down in music theory. Up first for our two games this week is 2006's Ōkami, the Japanese folklore adventure where a white wolf must save the world from an 8-headed demon by using a paintbrush.
After that, it's a game about throwing paint, chasing birds, and neglectful kings, 2012's The Unfinished Swan.
So yes, the theme this week, you could be like, oh, it's artful styles and things like that. No. Ink.
Yeah.
Ink is the theme this week. You have strokes from the celestial brush in Ōkami. You have gobs and gobs of ink being lobbed to create the world in The Unfinished Swan. It perfectly makes sense. Joe, how are you doing this week?
I am tired. Hope everybody out there had a good Thanksgiving. Hope you all enjoyed our Q&A episode. There was just a way for us to maybe give a slightly easier time the week of Thanksgiving, maybe.
Yeah, just a little breather, and hopefully you guys learned something new, and I think it's something we can do every year, assuming the show goes forward, and teasing some future episodes and all that at the end. That's some good stuff. So, yeah, back into it with a normal episode, but no composer follow-up news stories this week. We're going to get right into talking about our first game, and that is Ōkami. But we can't start talking about Ōkami without talking about Clover Studio. So, Clover Studio is a development group that Capcom spun off in the early 2000s with the initial intent of porting Beautiful Joe from the GameCube to the PlayStation 2. Apparently the name Clover is supposed to be a mashup, amalgamation, abbreviation of creativity lover. And it's also, in a way, a mashup of the Japanese symbols of mi for 3 and ba for leaf. And these mi and ba come from Capcom producers Shinji Mikami and Atsushi Inaba. So, mi and ba at the end of each of their names, 3 leaf, clover. I guess it's a combination of these things. So basically the people you need to know about when it comes to who is really the driving forces behind Clover Studio, it's Shinji Mikami, who, Resident Evil is like one of his babies. Essentially, he's gone on now to do like the Evil Within, so he still has a hand in games. Hideki Kamiya is another big name. You know him as the guy on Twitter with glasses and a shaved head who likes to ban people. He's the Bayonetta guy, the creator of Bayonetta and other games. I mean, he's an important influence as well. And then Atsushi Inaba was more as a I think like a producer role, not more of along the lines of the game developers like the legendary Mikami and Kamiya. But so like those are the 3 names you kind of need to know about when it comes to Clover Studio. So after that port of Beautiful Joe to PS2, Clover then developed Beautiful Joe 2, and they made it for both GameCube and PS2. And then they followed that up with a game called Ōkami, which was a brand-focused project that fit with Capcom's real true goal for Clover, which was to develop new IP. So after Ōkami came out, Clover worked on a game called God Hand, and that really failed to live up to sales expectations.
Boy, did it.
Yeah. And after that, the studio was shuttered. But the real reason, they at first said, it's because, God Hand performed so poorly. But the real reason was because Inaba, Kamiya, and Mikami left the company. And this actually happened really only like a few weeks after Ōkami released in North America, which was sometime after it did in Japan. So it's like this game Ōkami comes out and then suddenly Clover's no more. Oops. What did they do? They went and founded Seeds Inc., which was a new development group that eventually merged with another company called Odd Incorporated in October 2007, and this formed Platinum Games. And so everyone's like, oh, yeah, I've heard of Platinum Games today. Well, that's the brief history of from Capcom offshoot to Clover, main forces leaving Clover to then form their own thing, to then form Platinum Games. So what happened with this game, Ōkami, being made in the mid-2000s? First of all, I think we have to mention that the name of the game, the title, it's apparently a pun. See, the word Ōkami in Japanese means wolf. And when you see the wolf on the cover and the wolf is the protagonist, like, okay, that makes sense. But we're talking about like just the word, the symbol of Ōkami in Japanese. When you break it up into its kanji characters of O and Kami, I guess there's two separate kanji characters. These are pronounced identically, by the way. This splits up and means great deity. Which makes sense. Kami means God, and O kind of adds like O-sama is like a godly figure. So that kind of makes sense when you split it up that way. So essentially, the main character is a great wolf deity, and that totally checks out for this game. Though, then I guess apparently, when it's pronounced slightly differently, the same characters for Ōkami, when it's split up that way, they're also used in the honorific name of the Shinto sun goddess, Amaterasu, with Amaterasu O Mikami. So you have this character of Amaterasu who is taking the form of a wolf, but she's really a sun goddess, and this is Ōkami. Ōkami was released for PlayStation 2 on April 20th, 2006 in Japan, and September 19th, 2006 in North America, so a handful of months later. Europe and Australia would have to wait until February 2007 for this PlayStation 2 release. Then a Wii version launched in North America first. On April 15th, 2008, Europe would only have to wait until June 2008, a couple months later, but this Wii version didn't come to Japan until October 15th, 2009. So like a year and a half later, which is kind of crazy. If you're looking to play Ōkami today, though, I think the most accessible version would be Ōkami HD. And this is available now on pretty much every current major platform. It released first on PlayStation 3, though, as an exclusive remaster there on October 30th, 2012. PlayStation 4, Xbox One, PC got a version on December 12th, 2017. And Nintendo Switch got a version of Ōkami HD on August 9th, 2018. So if you want to play Ōkami today, it's certainly very possible to do so. The game is developed by Clover Studio, as I mentioned, published by Capcom. So Capcom's still supporting Clover in this way. What is Ōkami? Ōkami is a third-person action-adventure game that has gameplay that is very reminiscent of The Legend of Zelda. Apparently, Hideki Kamiya is a big, unabashed Zelda fan, and so this is, in a way, like his love letter to a Zelda-like game by using all these Japanese folklore references. But it's gameplay that involves combat with enemies, platforming, puzzle solving, and more. As I mentioned, though, probably the biggest standout difference, it's not, a humanoid character like Link as the protagonist. It's a wolf. And this wolf is in a world that has a woodcut watercolor style, a cel-shaded environment that almost looks like a Japanese ink illustration come to life. Sometimes it's known as an ink wash painting, but it's known in Japan as sumie style. Ōkami is also notable for its unique gameplay of the Celestial Brush, where the player can freeze time at any moment. A scroll kind of overlays itself on the world, and the player can draw symbols. And as the player, as Amaterasu, learns more skills, more possibilities more things you can be drawn, more abilities, things that you can change in the world. For example, you can cut enemies, you can create wind. You can spawn a bomb. You can connect water from one point to the other. This is often used in combat, but mostly in the world exploration, like generally solving puzzles like you would in a Legend of Zelda game. Ōkami's plot is heavily inspired by Japanese folklore. The game takes place in Nippon, Japan, where apparently 100 years ago, before the modern day of this story, 100 years ago, the white wolf Shiranui and the swordsman Nagi fought and sealed the 8-headed demon Orochi at a cave to save Kamiki village. Now, in present day, the swordsman Nagi's descendant and self-proclaimed greatest warrior, Susanoo, refuses to believe in Nagi's legend, and he accidentally frees Orochi, who escapes and curses the lands, sapping the life from Nippon. So now Sakuya, who is the wood sprite and guardian of the nearby Kamiki village, calls forth Amaterasu, the sun goddess, who now looks like the reincarnation of that white wolf Shiranui, to lift the curse, to bring life back to the land, and to honestly save the world. But Amaterasu, or Ami, won't be alone though, as she'll be accompanied by the inch-tall artist known as Isun. Can Amaterasu defeat Orochi to save Nippon? So Joe, here's where I'll ask you, what are our experiences with Ōkami?
I've seen some footage of the game sometimes. I've never played it. It is one of those games that is so heavily on my list of like, yeah, no, you gotta play this eventually. Like, eventually you gotta get around to this, and I've just never had a chance. I think I owned it on PS2, never played it. Bought it on PS3, never played it. I want to buy it on Switch. I'm worried I'll again never play it. The only thing that holds me back is I'm told that one of its only flaws is that it's way too long.
Yeah.
And that's about the only thing I ever hear about it. Like that's a criticism or anything, which is weird considering the criticisms I usually hear of games.
Yeah, you're right. You normally hear like, oh, it's too short. Yeah, if anything, it does kind of pad out a little bit. But yeah, it was a game that I tried first on Wii. And like I should have really liked it, but I didn't give it a fair enough chance, honestly. And then I went and played it on PS3 with that remake. Because yeah, it was one of those games like, oh man, especially if you love Zelda games, like you really need to try Ōkami. And that game is a work of art, honestly. Not just like for creating a game and the attention to detail through it all, but just how it looks and in motion. That game is a work of art. It's just amazing. So yeah, I've played it. I've beaten it. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I still have yet to own it on modern day systems, and I probably should, because I could certainly do with another playthrough of Ōkami. But it's a special game. It's a special soundtrack, and it's one that we were going to talk about eventually. And it's just odd that, after I talked about Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3, and we talked about, an Ōkami stage is being cut, and this character of Amaterasu in the game. Here we are a couple weeks later talking about Ōkami. So, as I alluded to, Hideki Kamiya was the lead designer for this game. And originally, Ōkami had more of a photorealistic 3D art style to it, which would have not held up particularly well over time, especially being originally designed on the PS2. And so this shift to a Sumie style not only made the game more memorable at the time, but also ensured that it really stands out today. Apparently, Amaterasu's initial designs were aimed to avoid the thought of having the character look like, quote, your pet wearing clothing, which that's an interesting quote, I guess. The developers had also considered Amaterasu metamorphosizing into different animal shapes based on where the wolf was traveling through. Like, if Amaterasu jumped into the water, she'd change into a dolphin. Or if she jumped off a cliff, maybe she'd change into a falcon. These ideas were dropped. For a very Japanese-focused game, it's pretty important to have a very good localization team effort, and they had to translate 1,500 pages of text, apparently. A puzzle even had to be changed in the game, which you don't often see. But for this one, in Japan, it required knowledge of a specific kanji character, which American Western players would just have no knowledge of. So this was translated over as each brushstroke being sketched out and demonstrated step by step in the West. Character voices weren't a concern, though, when it came to bringing the game over to the West, because this game has a very Banjo-like approach, a very Banjo-Kazooie-like approach to its character voices. Speech is made up of scrambling different samples of voice actors' speech, and then more emotional lines are created from voice work given in that emotion. So it's definitely a very kind of sound to it. I think Banjo's is a little goofier in a way, but it's the same sort of attempt, and it really carries over there. When the game was made for Wii, and it was made for things like, the move controls on PlayStation 3, it really helped with the ideal of the celestial brush. Again, that pausing the game, the scroll comes over the screen and the character can draw different shapes to create effects in the world. But when you have motion controls, boy, that's much easier to draw a circle and a stem for a bomb, as opposed to attempting this with an analog stick. So, it's something that can be lost, I guess, here and there when it comes to like a PS4 and Xbox One version. This is apparently still retained with Joy-Cons on the Switch. But it's just one of those extra little things. Like, it's an important element of the game, but would you like to draw the shapes with motion controls or draw them out with the analog stick? Ōkami is rated very highly. Metacritic on PS2 has a 93, which is rather good. Other versions of the game range from the low 90s to the high 80s, kind of just in that range. IGN described it as beautiful, charismatic, engaging, and one of the most original games you'll play anytime soon, at the time in 2006. The visual style, the attention to detail and quality, the atmosphere, these are all points of praise. There are also some complaints about length, as you said, of the game. Also some uneven difficulty spikes, or some challenges of getting certain brush patterns to be recognized with the Celestial Brush. But it's a game that really does stand the test of time with its art style. It's the same thought process with Wind Waker HD, for example. Like, that cel-shaded style carries over so well, especially when it's upscaled into higher resolution. Ōkami HD now on modern consoles, at least on PS4, Xbox One, PC, I believe it supports 4K textures, 4K resolution, and the game just shines. It's remarkable. Ōkami also won plenty of awards at the time. It wasn't one of these, sweeping every award, but certain awards, it was certainly notable. For example, at the 2007 BAFTA Awards, it won for Artistic Achievement and for Original Score. So, hey, there you go, the music there. It also won Best Character Design at the 2007 Game Developers' Choice Awards. It won the grand prize in the Entertainment Division of the 2006 Japan Media Arts Festival. And it was also IGN's Game of the Year for 2006. They also named it the 90th best video game of all time in 2017 when they created a list of the 100 best. And it was also awarded the best anthropomorphic video game in the 2006 Ursa Major Awards. So, I don't know what those awards are.
I've never heard of that.
I just saw that award title. I'm like, that's going in the notes here. The problem with Ōkami, though, was I talked about how God Hand after it did really terribly in terms of sales and all that. Ōkami didn't do great either. And so it started a downward trend where God Hand was the last stand. In 2006, the game sold 200,000 copies in North America and 66,000 copies in Japan. In Japan, the game where it's like a love letter to their folklore with Susanoo and Yamata no Orochi, their legendary folklore. It's catered to them, and it sells 66,000 copies that year. So clearly, the game was below expectations for Capcom. But now the game has sold more than 1 million copies across PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Switch versions of the game as of September 2019. And it's also sold more than 2.8 million copies lifetime across all versions. So definitely a cult classic. Did not do well at the time, but long-term word of mouth has really helped Ōkami's status going forward as a legendary video game in a way. What is Ōkami's legacy? Well, a sequel was made. It's called Ōkami Den, and it was made for Nintendo DS, released in Japan on September 30th, 2010, and then mid-March 2011 for the rest of the world. Definitely the touchscreen helps with the brushstrokes. You play as Chibitarasu, a wolf pup, wolf male pup. This is 9 months after the original game's events. And so that's Ōkami Den in a nutshell. It wasn't as well received as Ōkami, but it's out there, and it's always referenced like, oh, they should make a sequel to Ōkami. And it's like, while that would be nice, I think it's a game that really just stands really nicely on its own. And yes, keep remaking it. It holds up so well, I think, if you play it today. The final boss of Yami is the final boss in 2008's Tatsunoko vs. Capcom Ultimate All-Stars, which that was weird at the time. It's like, oh, okay. You think like, what's this big sphere with a claw and all that, or tentacles? And that's the final boss from Ōkami. Amaterasu, as we mentioned a couple weeks ago, a character in 2011's Marvel vs. Capcom 3. And there are lots of Capcom references in Ōkami, but these references carry forward, especially in Hideki Kamiya games. So when Bayonetta transforms into a panther in her game, and when she runs, flowers and plant life are created behind her while she's running. That is a direct homage to Amaterasu in Ōkami. There was also 4 arranged albums, like different remixes of Ōkami's soundtrack. These were released in 2015, and they're called Ōkami Henkyokushu. These 4 volumes include retro remixes, jazz remixes, lounge remixes, and a healing style. 4 officially arranged albums of Ōkami's music. So I found that super interesting. The soundtrack is primarily headed up by one Masami Ueda. Masami Ueda, he was born on November 19th, 1974 in Hyogo, Japan. He joined Capcom in April 1995, and he first composed an obscure arcade game called Mitenshinzeo. Mitenshinzeo. Yeah, I haven't heard of it either.
Yeah, that's not what obscure arcade game. I mean, they certainly got that right.
Absolutely. He stayed at Capcom until June 2004, which is when he then moved to work at Clover Studio. He stayed there until October 2007, when he left and joined Platinum Games. So Masami Ueda then eventually left Platinum in September 2018, and he became a freelance composer. He has thoughts about game music that, quote, great game music is music that was made for the game. No matter how good your music is, if it doesn't fit the game, it's not great game music. At that point, you're just talking about a nice song. And I feel like that really ties in nicely with our Thanksgiving Q&A episode, actually. Like, in case you skipped out on that one, like, it ties really nicely with the point where you were talking about how game music is so important because of context. Mm-hmm. Yeah, a song can be nice if you just listen to it without the context, but game soundtracks are so important because they're tied with certain moments or areas or events. So, yeah, the context is super important. I think he really ties into that nicely. Masami Ueda also enjoys photography as a hobby. So because he was with Capcom in the late 90s and early 2000s, he has a big hand in some of their prominent franchises. So he's composed for the first 3 Resident Evil games. Kind of big ones, really important. Also that old original Resident Evil 4 that turned into Devil May Cry. He's the top billing composer on the original Devil May Cry. Also composed for Beautiful Joe 1 and 2, Ōkami, and also he's part of the big development and composing teams for Bayonetta 1 and 2. He's also thrown his hand into some arrangements for Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, and we like to mention when composers do that. He arranged the new remix of Theme of Solid Snake from Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. He also arranged Dance with Gold, the song from Castlevania Symphony of the Night. And also in the recent Terry Bogard DLC pack, he arranged the Banquet of Nature remake from Samurai Showdown. Some interesting notes about the soundtrack development for Ōkami. Other composers on the project include Hiroshi Yamaguchi, who is Ueda's protege, essentially. He talked about in an interview, Ueda, where it's like, when he was working on Bayonetta, he started primarily working as the lead for that, but then he decided that he wanted to pass the bulk of the work off to his protege, Yamaguchi. And so I guess, I think Yamaguchi is technically like the top billing on that soundtrack then. So it's interesting that, they worked together still, even back in 2006 for Ōkami. So yes, Masami Ueda, Hiroshi Yamaguchi, Rei Kondo, who we mentioned on a past episode, part of T's music there, mentioned during Fire Emblem Awakening, and Akari Kaida, who I guess had ties with Ueda even back to that first Resident Evil game. The soundtrack is certainly influenced by Gagaku, and Gagaku is a 7th century Japanese classical music style, kind of meant for imperial court performances and dances. If you hear some of the samples of I don't want to say stereotypical or cliche, but like the Japanese yells, like the yo or the oh kind of things, like this is apparently coming from Gagaku, apparently. And so there are a couple of those certainly in this soundtrack. You'd think that, Ōkami, it's a Japanese folklore game. It must be Japanese only music, only Japanese styles. Well, apparently this is not the case. According to Ueda, quote, regarding harmony and musical scales, chord progression is Western style. And I realized that by paying attention to melody, tone, and the way I used grace notes, I could make something that wasn't quite Japanese style, but sounded like it. It was easier not being bound by Japanese instruments. That said, we used Japanese instruments that play melodies as much as we could, and for percussion, we used Japanese percussion instruments. They used these Japanese percussion instruments like a shimedaiko, which is a small, short but wide drum, and also a tsuzumi, which is like an hourglass-shaped drum that has like these elastic cords that allow players to change the length of the drum and thus change like the sound and the pitch of the drum. But it really turns out that there are very few styles that actually use traditional Japanese style in Ōkami. Apparently, when the brush gods appear to give Ami new brush techniques, also when the player is on the save screen, apparently these are just like a couple of the few examples of when a song is traditionally Japanese. The rest of it, apparently is kind of more Western styled, but uses instruments and just overall the sound overall to almost sound like it is Japanese inspired. So that's something I learned. I always thought it was like, oh yeah, this is as Japanese music gets. Like, boom, Ōkami, like, define. Well, apparently not the case. So there you go. Learn something a little bit new here. What does this sound like, though? Let's get to the 5 critical tracks. And I think we have to start off with one of the better field music in all of games. It's like one of the first overworld themes, triumphant in a way that you hear. This is Shinshu Field 1. So these field themes are generally split up into like 2 parts on the soundtrack. Like as you get later into the game, like I think it builds more instruments on it, makes it sound more triumphant. And it's also important to note that for Shinshu Field in particular, it starts as cursed, right? Because at the beginning of the game, it's like, oh, Ami, help us, purify the land and lift the curse that Orochi, the released Orochi has placed upon the land. So at first you don't hear this triumphant theme, but you're rewarded with it once you clear this first area. And boy, like it has that same level of and feeling, I think, of like Ocarina of Time's Hyrule Field theme in a way. But yeah, some of these Japanese themes and instruments, you get some strings, some flutes, some brass samples that really stand out. And even like then this is like the bass line. Eventually they add like more percussion and some more fanfare to it. But this is just one of those classic Ōkami songs that it's like, yeah, this one had to be here for sure. Like it's a first sign that you're opening up the world and you're making progress and you're rewarded with this field theme.
I can definitely hear some Hyrule Field to this. Yeah, 100%. This isn't quite what I was expecting when I thought like, oh, Ōkami music. So like, now it makes sense when earlier you were like, well, a lot of the songs don't actually use like the Japanese traditional stuff. I thought they did.
Mm-hmm. yeah, I think a lot of people do.
Hearing this for the first time was like, that's different than what I expected. It's good, but huh.
Yeah, and I think it's really based on like the melodies, like as you said, the focus on melody and having that really drive things and chord progressions and harmonies there. Yeah, so this one really stands out. But for number 2 on the critical tracks, it's a similar sort of song, and it's deeper into the game, but I really like it, I think, more personally. This is Ryoshima Coast 2. While Shinshu Field was composed by Masami Ueda, this one is composed by his protege, Hiroshi Yamaguchi. I think it's very similar to Shinshu Field, where it's that open environment and it feels like triumphant in a way. But this is in a place, obviously, with coast in the title. You have like the open ocean air. So like there's more brass to it. There's just a greater sense of adventure, I think, because you're also, you're like halfway into the game at this point. So like you're really making progress. The open world, overworld theme has to kind of change up a little bit. So it does in this way. You're in a different part of the world, but it has that same sort of feel, but just it's a different tone to it. I think I like this one. While Shinshu Field is more of like the classic Ōkami overworld theme, this one I like more, and that's why I put it here.
I think I agree with you. This one just feels a lot cooler, and it's the faster pace, I think, to it. I really, really like I can picture walking out into this area and be like, all right, let's do this. We're in. Go. Next part. Let's do this now. I think it's also the percussion.
Yeah, absolutely. The percussion helps. And this is part of why, like, this was number 2, like, this is part 2 in a way. So, like, this is, the more instrumentation added to it. At the beginning of part 1, it's a very similar sort of sparse instrumentation. But, again, it's like, it's trying to grow over time, so it's not the same exact theme played over and over again. So, it's just, really neat in that way. Number 3, I'm going to go with Playing with Waka. This is composed by both Masami Ueda and Hiroshi Yamaguchi. You can sometimes also find it titled Waka's Promenade or Ushiwaka's Dance. And this is Ueda's favorite song that he wrote for the game. It's always neat when you can kind of like stumble upon that fact in interviews, like when people ask like, what was your favorite song that you wrote for this one? Like you personally. And so he pointed to this one with Playing with Waka. Waka is a weird character. Ushiwaka, this mysterious character who has like the gift of foresight, and his story resolves in a very interesting way at the end. This song plays in particular when you're battling him in Agata Forest or Taka Pass, and also when you're battling any of the canine warriors, which that's an interesting little side quest. Yeah, this is just intense. This clip here is kind of from the middle of the piece a little bit, but I mean, the driving percussions, the yo's in the background, like this is intense battle music, and it's certainly one of the more focused, like you need to be on your top of your game for this battle here. I mean, it's not end game stuff, certainly. We'll get to that. But for battles that'll kind of surprise you in the world, this is probably what most people think is like, oh, this is probably more traditional Japanese. But again, like you're focusing on the melodies, you're focusing on the different harmonies and supports and all that. So this is a really, really cool one. And being a personal favorite of Ueda's helps.
I think it's also a personal favorite of mine.
Yeah.
Just on this list, I think this is my favorite on the list.
Mine will be later on this list, but that is not a unique opinion of mine. I think a lot of people share that one. Until we get there, let's get to number 4 on the Critical 5. This is Battle of Orochi 2. Does this sound like it could have been in Fire Emblem Awakening? Well, you're right. It's because it's composed by Rei Kondo. This is also titled Yamata no Orochi's Extermination 1 and 2 again. So, yeah. Orochi, like the beast that was released at the beginning of the game by Susanoo. Orochi is an interesting boss battle because, like, at the halfway point, you face him for the first time. And then, like a Zelda game, there's a halfway point break, and then more happens in the second half of the game. Shocker. So I think this one takes place, especially in the final confrontation with Orochi. And it's an interesting battle where you have the 8 dragon-like heads of the demon, and you're really pulling in all these celestial brush techniques. So, like, based on environmental clues, it's like, well, this is how you should, pull him out. Does he have a pool of water by him? Maybe you should connect the pool of water to his face to, help knock him out and make him unconscious. So different little things like that. It's an intense battle. But yeah, hearing this is like, oh yeah, that's Rei Kondo for sure. But yeah, no, it's a really, really cool sound to it. Like a lot darker than most of the soundtrack. And I really dig it. But the Rei Kondo track that I think everyone associates with this game, my personal favorite, a lot of people's favorites. This is Rising Sun. And if you're like, but isn't this called The Sun Rises? Yeah, it is more frequently called that. More frequently called The Sun Rises. But I'm using the localized track titles according to its official soundtrack release, according to VGMDB.net. So, Rising Sun it is for this list. They even note in interviews with Ueda where he says that, playing with Waka is his favorite. He even notes that, but The Sun Rises is the fan favorite from this game. And as it should, it might as well be the main theme. It plays off of main themes. This is the song that plays in the final phase against the final boss, Yami. So, yeah, this is what got tied into Amaterasu's theme from Marvel vs. Capcom 3.
That's where I know it from.
So, yep, justifiably so. This is like the Ōkami song. Plain and simple.
Yeah, it's the only one I knew coming into this because of Marvel vs. Capcom 3. So good to hear the original for the first time ever.
And yeah, it's not too different than that Marvel vs. Capcom version. I mean, yeah, the MVC version had a bit more like synthy beats and bass and all that to it, but like it's pretty spot on.
It's very, very good. And I still think I like playing with Waka a little bit better. But that might just be, I haven't played the game yet.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll feel differently after I've played Ōkami.
Context. When it comes to tracks on the cutting room floor, I have a couple. This first one being Brave Warrior Oki. This kind of gets into like end game stuff. This song plays during dialogue sequences with Oki. Sometimes it's also titled Oki Kurumi the Hero. Oki Kurumi the Hero. Composed by Hiroshi Yamaguchi. It's a good sound, and like you wouldn't expect it in like a normal dialogue sort of sequence. So when it popped up out of nowhere, it's like, whoa, what is this song? And when I'm flipping through the soundtrack again, I'm like, I still really like the sound of this. So I think it was more just a personal choice, not like tied to a moment or a character, but like just the sound of this is very good, I think. And then I also want to put Reset Thank You version on the list. This really starts with like a soft piano melody and like a flute a little bit, and then eventually builds to this in the clip here. Also composed by Hiroshi Yamaguchi. This plays during the dialogue sequence where important things happen before that final phase against Ōkami. So it goes from like this into triumphantly with the sunrises, rising sun. And it's interesting that they throw thank you version on the end of this title because the end credits of the PS2 version of Ōkami had a vocal version of this theme of Reset. And so that's why the title is slightly different. This didn't necessarily carry over into the recent versions. Maybe it was possibly because of like licensing issues with the vocal artist. I couldn't really find out exactly why, but for whatever reason, like the vocal version in the credits didn't make its way over. But we're left with this, and a lot of people really like this song. So I think it's important to include it at least on the cutting room floor. So what will I never forget about Ōkami? It's what I tell people. It's just how great of a Zelda game this is. Like, this is the best non-Zelda Zelda game ever made. And don't let the fact that you're controlling a wolf throw you off, because you played Twilight Princess. You should be very familiar with that. That also came out in 2006. Just saying.
That's a really weird coincidence, actually.
Yeah. So, honestly, like, I think if you're itching to play a Zelda game and you won't find a linear one in a traditional style, especially after how well Breath of the Wild did, I think if you haven't played Ōkami, I think you really owe it to yourself to try it. The artistry alone is just remarkable, and you won't see anything else like it for, I think, a very long time.
I will never forget the art style, because it's all I've seen, but everything I ever see about it is like, this is one of the best aged art styles video games have ever seen, and I'm inclined to agree.
100%. So to transition to our next game, we like to highlight a fan cover, a fan remix, whether it's on OC Remix, on YouTube, wherever it goes. I had to find something of the sunrises, of Rising Sun. It's just that song from Ōkami. And I found something on YouTube by user Hayatebune. And Hayatebune did an electric guitar cover several years ago of the sunrises. I really like the sound of it. I hope you do too. Please enjoy. We'll be right back.
So our next game is a little bit lower profile from a Capcom game. The Unfinished Swan was originally released for the PlayStation 3 on October 23rd, 2012, and it would later re-release on the PS4 and Vita on October 28th, 2014. It was developed by Giant Sparrow and published by Sony Computer Entertainment, and it is a game where you are put in control of a young boy named Monroe, whose mother has recently passed. And she was an artist who had a really weird habit of not really finishing any of her paintings. One such that was her favorite was a painting of a swan, and when Monroe was sent to the orphanage, they only allowed him to bring one of her paintings, and that happens to be the one that he chose, because, it was her favorite. He wanted a good keepsake of his mother. One night, he wakes up and finds that the swan is gone. It's not in the frame anymore, and there are some footprints leading to a door that was not there before. So he grabs his mom's paintbrush and walks through this mysterious door and finds himself in a new world that at first is a stark white. And he learns that this world is the domain of an artistic king who is also just sort of a pretentious jerk. I meant to replay this game before we did this episode, and then I just ran out of time to do so, so I watched a long play to sort of refresh myself. And at one point, the narrator says, the king loved pottery, and he ignored his subjects when they said, hey, we don't have a place to go to the bathroom, because he was so into his pottery. So they started going to the bathroom in his pots. And that's when he was like, oh, I'll build a sewer. 1 second. So the king was kind of a jerk, and he only cared about his art, not really about the people that were living in the kingdom, which he just considered another piece of art. And Monroe must chase the swan throughout this now abandoned kingdom in a story that is presented in a storybook manner, narrated by Julie Pari. In terms of gameplay, you may have seen The Unfinished Swan, actually. At the start, you are in a completely white area, and you have to throw globs of paint at the world around you to sort of reveal what's around you so that you can see the paths and all that. It's really weird and interesting, and that's mainly what people think most of Unfinished Swan is. It's not. That's just the first part. You can always throw the globs of ink, but it's not always like that's the only way you can see the world around you. But because it was the first 10 minutes of the game, that's what people assume. But eventually, the paint becomes your manner of interacting with the world, like flipping switches or spinning wheels or watering vines so that they grow on a wall and you can climb on them. And it also adds eventually, as you walk through, the story will tell you, the subjects got really tired of living in a pure white world where they kept hitting their knees and stuff on things they couldn't see. So they got really mad at the king, and he was like, fine, I'll paint shadows on things and stuff like that. And the world sort of evolves over time as this sort of living art piece. So Monroe must chase the unfinished swan through this kingdom to catch it, and also solve the mystery of where did the king go and how did Monroe end up here? So this is where I ask, what are your experiences with the Unfinished Swan?
I played it. I beat it. It's not a very long game. So I will say that if anyone's looking and thinks oh, that sounds interesting, it's a pretty quick experience, 2 to 3 hours.
The long play I watched finished it in an hour, which is quick from what I can gather. But yeah, it's about 2 to 3 hours. That sounds about right.
So yeah, I beat it. I enjoyed it. Ooh, I wish I could remember more about it though. I do remember the mechanics and the way you interact with the world, but oh man, when I'm thinking back on the narrative, it's that's a little sketchy. I couldn't have pulled the name Monroe out of nowhere, honestly. So maybe it wasn't that memorable. I think the soundtrack certainly stands out. Its main theme is especially memorable. That's the one thing I do definitely recall. But yeah, it's definitely the artistry. Again, it's like using the ink and how this game is another one where, yep, that's a style that will stand the test of time. Like, you're not going to, say, oh, no, that looks ugly. Like, no, that one really works. So kudos to that one. Yeah, I played that. I remember it because of in the credits. It was the first time I ever saw someone with my last name in the credits of a video game.
Wait, really?
So I don't remember what they do, but yeah. So someone with the last name of Spezia is in the credits to the Unfinished Swan.
Interesting. I'm kind of in the same boat where I didn't remember much from this game. I had to actively go look up the main character's name in order to talk about this game. I would not put it down as one of the most memorable games I've ever played. I do enjoy Giant Sparrow's work. I played their most recent game that came out last year. Had a good time with it.
And that one is special, my goodness.
That one is very good. But this one it's a good start, but it's not a game that I could really picture myself being like, I'm really itching to go play Unfinished Swan. Like I said, I was going to replay it specifically just, to refresh myself for the show. And I just never ended up getting around to it, unfortunately. But I played it back in 2013, I want to say.
Yeah, I think I played it pretty close to launch. It's definitely one of those ones where it's like, oh yeah, that was a game. Like, it's not in the standouts in the chronology of indie games. Like, gosh, no. But yeah, people mention it's like, oh yeah, I like that game. That was a good game. Kind of that same level on it.
So the game itself actually began development in February of 2008, and it actually started, as many indie games do, as a student project for a group of students from the University of Southern California. And they showed off the original prototype at the Independent Games Festival in 2008, and actually ended up being a finalist in the student games category, but lost to the team behind Tag: The Power of Paint. Now, fun note that is not actually super related to the Unfinished Swan, but I find very interesting because this sparked a reminder in my head when I read the name of that game. The team behind Tag: The Power of Paint would later be acquired by Valve, and their prototype and work would be implemented into Portal 2 as the various gels. Which is also, a very big coincidence of like two paint-based games show up at the IGF that year. There must have been something in the water. But yeah, I just found that very interesting that while they did lose, they lost to another studio that would also sort of get the same deal as them, because the team behind Unfinished Swan must have impressed somebody, because first of all, this demo was not like the game we know today. The way they describe it, and they have never released this prototype. As far as I'm aware, there's no footage of this prototype. We just have their word to go by. It, quote, had a much more desolate feeling to it and featured music from the artist Moby that he had released for non-commercial use. But apparently, like, even by the time they had shown up at the IGF, they had decided, no, I think a storybook sort of aesthetic would fit this game a lot better. So let's go in that way. But like I said, it must have impressed somebody, because Sony later that year signed an incubation deal with Giant Sparrow, which immediately after IGF gave them office space in one of Sony's buildings. It gave them funding to make the game, and also they were in the same building as Sony Santa Monica and told that they were able to ask them for advice whenever they needed it. So, like, they must have impressed somebody real good for that. Now, apparently the two biggest inspirations for the game are Alice in Wonderland, both the book and the Disney film, as well as the film Time Bandits. I don't know if you've ever heard of Time Bandits.
I haven't.
I have, because Ben is a very big fan of Time Bandits. It's a really, really weird movie. And that's all I'm going to say on that. It sure is an interesting film. And that's honestly it. I found a bunch of like videos about like the game and people like interviewing the devs, and all of them that I watched, I was like, this is all like interesting, but it's not, this is stuff that I'd bring up on the show. Like it's not really relevant to what I'm talking about. So there are like developer interviews and stuff you can find, but it wasn't a lot of stuff that I felt like I could use on this show specifically. It was released to kind of mixed reviews. Overall, positive. The game is currently sitting at a 79 on Metacritic. But for the most part, like, reviewers sort of commented that the game was very short, which, again, like, the game costed like $20, if that. Like, really? Come on. But also a critique that it never seemed to really stick to one mechanic and really flesh it out and do everything they could. And during one of the interviews that I watched, the director actually talked about how their goal was, when they were playtesting, they would watch to see, well, how long does it take the average player to completely understand exactly what's going on with this mechanic? All right, at that point, it's time to move on to the next mechanic. And I think they kind of came to the conclusion of that might have been a bad idea. It makes it feel a little bit, I don't want to say schizophrenic, but like you get what I mean by that, right? Like it's jumping back and forth between different stuff the whole game.
And I understand the fear that they didn't want to have it be too padded, but I think finding a happy medium might have been a little, probably would have been a good idea.
But of course, reviewers pretty much all agreed that the game does have a very great sense of wonder and a unique feeling to it, and also, you know, a fantastic art style. So there was that as well. It won 2 BAFTAs in 2013, one of them being Game Innovation and Best Debut Game, and it was nominated for Best Original Music at the BAFTAs as well. It also, and I didn't know this until I went looking for the remix to be our playout song, it has representation in PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale.
It sure does.
I had no idea. It is like, for people that don't know, All-Stars Battle Royale was Sony's sort of attempt to do their own Super Smash Brothers, ill-fated attempt. And the way they handled stages was every stage was a fusion combination of 2 games, and Unfinished Swan ended up fused with Medieval, which that must have been kind of cool at least, because that's considered like a classic PS1 game, and then there's your indie game, and it gets to be part of that stage too.
Mm-hmm.
Giant Sparrow would actually go on to release another game in April of 2017, being What Remains of Edith Finch, and this game actually adds some canon to the Unfinished Swan.
Yeah.
But you'll have to play it to find out what that is.
Play Edith Finch. Like, look, play Unfinished Swan. Don't get us wrong. Like, it's a good game to experience. But as we alluded to earlier, Edith Finch is the real Giant Sparrow standout.
Edith Finch is a step up. And it just came out on Switch, too. And it's a pretty good Switch. Well, not just came out on Switch. It came out on Switch months ago. But it's a pretty good, like, port, too. So, absolutely. If you enjoy like narrative games, What Remains of Edith Finch? Probably for you. Now, the music of the Unfinished Swan was done by one Joel Corelitz. Now, according to him, he began composing at the age of 5 by creating tunes on a Fisher-Price 826 cassette recorder. Which, that's a new one.
Yeah, I mean, it's not an electone in Japan.
It's not an electone. Like, I don't think we've said the words Fisher-Price yet on this show.
Not even like
fair.
A Fisher-Price keyboard. Blam, 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 blam.
So he says that he also used this to record what he describes as, quote, ridiculous radio shows. I don't know what this means. He does not elaborate on it, but I'm pretty sure I can probably guess.
That sounds like me when I was a kid. I did dumb stuff like that.
From there, he went on to study guitar and piano for years, and he would also end up saving up and buying himself a synthesizer, drum machine, and some sequencing software to begin composing his first music. And he would attend college later at the Oberlin Conservatory of Music.
Good school.
Specifically studying technology in music-related arts. That was the name of the program that he was in, where he specialized in experimental synthesis. I don't know what that means. I'm going to assume it just means it's a fancy word for synths.
Not exactly. I would venture a guess that in this case, synthesis being the combination of sounds. So taking different sounds and combining them together and trying to forge something new out of disparate parts.
And he also specialized in music for interactive installations, which I assume mostly means video games, but probably not like also like, I don't know, like museum exhibits and stuff like that, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think that's closer to it. Yeah.
Yeah. But nowadays that would probably just mean video games for the most part. He graduated with honors and went on to work in Chicago for many years, mainly composing for commercials, but then would go on to start his own studio called Wave Plant, and Unfinished Swan happened to be his first game project. And in 2013, his work on the Unfinished Swan would win him the Gang Rookie of the Year award. We talked about Gang a couple weeks ago. It's the Game Audio Network Guild, set up by a bunch of veterans in the game music and game sound sort of area. It won him a Rookie of the Year award. That's the point. That's the main point that I'm trying to get across. And according to a quote on his website, he believes, quote, technology has a soul, and music and sound design are part of the same thing. When asked what franchises he would love to work on someday, he listed Destiny, Final Fantasy, and a From Software game. So holding out for you, buddy. As for his discography, obviously Unfinished Swan, again, that was his first game project. Hohokum is a game that I've heard the name of and then haven't played.
Mm-hmm.
But he did the music for that. He did the music for a game called The Tomorrow Children, Tumbleseed. I have not heard of either of those games.
I have. Yeah, that's neat. I mean, again, indie games. Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm. But I have heard of what is his most well-known soundtrack right now, a game that I have not played but very much would like to try, Gorogoa, which is a puzzle game that is apparently supposed to be very good. He did the music for a game called Eastward, and he was a contributor of music and sound design for Death Stranding.
Aha.
Which, that's a big one. That's a big get right there.
Yeah. I think what it's Ludwig Forsyth or something like that, who composed for Metal Gear Solid 5, like, is the main composer for Death Stranding.
Mm-hmm.
But, I mean, God, to contribute to a Kojima game, like, that's got to be something where if he wants to make connections to Final Fantasy or FromSoft, like, you connect through Kojima and his knowledge of the Japanese game industry.
Yeah, that's a good start. That's a real good start. The soundtrack of Unfinished Swan itself is a mix of sort of electronic synths and a string quartet and a string orchestra. The live instruments were apparently recorded at Ocean Way Studios in Nashville and were recorded by the Nashville Music Scoring Orchestra. And when asked what the highlight of his career so far is, this was back in 2018, he says that he'll never forget recording strings for this score as it was his first experience doing such a thing.
Joel Corelitz, a name that I had not really heard of before, but now connecting those strings to all those different games, one I will definitely remember.
Mm-hmm. So let's go ahead and get into our Critical 5 so we can hear how this fusion sort of sounds, and we're going to start with the main theme of the game, the Unfinished Swan. So this song sounds like a Professor Layton puzzles theme.
Yeah.
Like, surely I'm not the only one that hears that. But also, like, it's a very, very good song. You mentioned it being like one of the more memorable songs in the game. I would agree with that. I think it is. This is a gorgeous piece that just immediately tells you exactly what you're getting into, I think.
Yeah, that main leitmotif of the da 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 da, like that's screaming this game. Like that is this game to a T. Starts off nice and simple, plucky, and then just adds the more instrumentation to it. So good. Like obviously titled off of the game, it was gonna be here, and it's a main theme, but obviously deserves to be here.
Yeah, it's a very good piece. I don't know what else to say. It sounds like it belongs to Professor Layton. No one will ever convince me otherwise. Not that anyone's trying. Track number 2 is Monroe's Story. So this is the kind of music that I actually tend to think of when I think of this game, just off the top of my head. And it's this really gorgeous sort of xylophone-ish piece. It's not ambient, but it's about as close as it can be without being ambient, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It just feels very peaceful and very full of wonder, and I think this is among my favorite tracks in the game.
It's definitely a good one to space out to. I think part of the challenge for me, like when I'm hearing these, and I'm not sure how much research you were able to find, but it's like it's probably pretty hard to place these in the game and where they all take place.
Kind of, a little bit. I can tell, I know where the next one plays, and that's about it. It is one of those soundtracks where, like, you listen to it after the fact, and you're like, yeah, this is pretty good, but, like, in-game, it kind of gets muddied a little bit, and I'm not sure how, because this isn't like, usually when we talk about that sort of effect, we're talking about how I was kind of busy when this song was playing, and it kind of went over my head, but that's not really the case in Unfinished Swan, because that game is very slow and calm and methodic, and I don't know.
But it supports the atmosphere. Although when you're talking about an ambience, there's not a melody that's getting stuck in your head and that you revisit later and say, oh yeah, I know exactly where that takes place. Like, it's just not that.
But speaking of a melody that gets stuck in your head, our next track is Palace Reverie. It's just these repeated notes. The harpsichord really makes it, I think. I really like it whenever a harpsichord comes up in this soundtrack. So there's another Palace song that is on my cutting room floor that's probably the one I would more think of when I think of this game. But I think this is the better song.
Yeah.
Overall. So I felt like, it could be one or the other, and I'm going to go with the one that I like more. I really like this piece. All of the Palace music is great. And a very enjoyable song.
Yeah, nothing like a harpsichord to represent like a sort of royal reverence in a way. Like to say that you're in a palace. But it's not exactly a harpsichord. Like, this is where we're talking about, like, it's live instruments recorded, but then we're doing some synth work here. So, like, the hits, like the attack on the notes is a little electronic. Like, it's pretty neat.
Yeah. Obviously, a real harpsichord would be like a lot more sort of in your face. But yeah, it's just this and Monroe's Story, I think, are two really good examples of the whole, like, it's a fusion of electronic and traditional instruments. And it's just, we hear that a lot nowadays, but we didn't hear that very often back in like 2012. Now that indie composers are able to like get a hold of live instruments, you hear that a lot more nowadays. But, just wasn't a thing you heard all that often back then. Like, think of Thomas Was Alone. That was a novel thing for that game to have done. So, yeah. Up next, we're going to get a little more sinister and mysterious and jump into the Labyrinth. Like, talk about a change of tone.
Oof.
Like, this song is suddenly like, you don't know where you are, and anything could be around the next corner. Solve mysteries now, buddy. For that reason alone, I think I wanted to put it on this Critical 5, because it's just so different and so weird compared to everything else.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. I mean, again, we like to talk about like the range of sounds on a soundtrack and different things that stand out. I mean, this one stands out because it's different. I think the next track goes above and beyond that even more, but good to show the transition of the light, kind of bouncy, fluffy music to something a little more serious going on.
Oh yeah, and speaking of the next track, you're absolutely right, 'cause let's ramp that tone up just a little bit more with The Deluge. I don't remember where this plays, but you think I would? Like, this song, why is this so intense? It's just in your face suddenly, and it's the only song on the soundtrack like this.
That sounds awesome. Yeah, I have no idea.
And I don't really have much to say. Like, this is another one of those, like, really cool sort of fusions. But also, like, if you listen to this song and didn't know anything about the Unfinished Swan, and then listen to the Unfinished Swan, you'd be like, these aren't from the same game.
No, gosh, no.
No way. This sounds like something I'd hear in, what's a game I feel like I would hear this in?
Like Inside, maybe?
No, because Inside is more like tense, quiet sort of stuff. I'd say, like, this sounds almost like it would be in some, like, medieval combat game. Almost. Like, I want to say Assassin's Creed, but I don't know. But it doesn't sound like it belongs on Unfinished Swan, and yet it fits so perfectly among this soundtrack. And I love it. It's a fantastic, fantastic song.
Yeah, really cool piece overall. I'm glad it's here.
As for our songs on the cutting room floor, I have two. One of them is more of that good harpsichord, Palace Minuet. So this is admittedly the one that I think of the most when I think of, palace music in this game. Because this is the one that's like disgustingly catchy.
Oh, yes, yeah.
I still think the other one is better, but this one is very, very good.
Yeah, it's totally bouncy and, pretty similar in a way to Palace Reverie with the instrumentation, but that makes sense. Palace, but I almost hear this and think like happy platformer first world kind of thing. I don't know.
This sounds like it would be in the first level of a happy platformer. You're right. That's pretty good. And then the song that sounds very similar to it, but I still had a good time with it, with a little bit different instrumentation. Statue Garden. More of that palacey feeling stuff. And I don't know, man. I really like the faux harpsichord. It's really good. And you don't hear it very often in video games unless it's like a medieval setting or something like that. I've always sort of considered a harpsichord to be like a sinister sounding soundtrack because of video games. Because like think of Power Hungry Fool from Fire Emblem.
Yeah.
That's the song that comes to mind when I think of harpsichords and stuff like that. So yeah, I think this is a good change of pace for my brain, and I really I don't know, I like that sound.
Yeah, I think you did a really good job kind of covering. It's a short album. Like, it's not the biggest, album release of its soundtrack. So I think you did a really good job covering it. That's why I don't have any songs on the cutting room floor. I think you did a really good job covering it overall, even though I've also played the game. When it comes to what I'll never forget about it, I think it's a delight to that mechanic of throwing the paint and creating at your whim. I mean, yes, the bones of the level structure is there, but how do you want it to look? And, of course, yeah, there is the stuff with spinning the propellers and hitting the switches and the vines, which can be a right pain in the butt.
Apparently, that part, according to one of the interviews that I saw, was originally about 2 hours long, and they trimmed it down.
I'm so glad they did. Wow. But I think there's something special about creating your own visual style based on the bones of what the developers have made for you.
I will never forget that it's just a neat little game with a really neat little setting, and it's told through this storybook art style that always sort of gets me. Not really art style, but like aesthetic, where somebody's reading you a little picture book, and it always feels great. And the very distinct and clean art style makes it very satisfying to, mess it up. Globs of paint.
Yeah.
And I also, after experiencing the story again, after playing What Remains of Edith Finch, I no longer feel sorry for that character.
Yeah, it's a good way of putting all of that. Well, ink abound. It creates a visual style, but it's always nice to talk about the soundtracks for these two games as well. And they're very different, but they're also both very special. That will do it for us this week on Original Soundchat. You can find me on Twitter at PeteSpeakeasy. Joe is over at the Devaga. You can find the video version of the show on the Rhymes with Asia YouTube channel, also at rhymeswithasia.com. But it's that MP3 podcast version you want. Thanks to Anonymous Dinosaur over at anondino.squarespace.com. You can find those MP3 podcasts on podcast services all around the globe. Apple Podcasts, Google Play, just search Original Soundchat there. You can take us with you in your car, on a run, at work, but we won't tell your boss that you're listening to conversations about great video game soundtracks. And then when you're done listening, hit us up on social media at Soundchat OST for giving us feedback on how we're doing and also suggestions for games that you'd like us to cover. How is that Spotify playlist with the Original Soundchat playlist? We like to add the songs that we talk about if they're on Spotify, because we can't be on Spotify ourselves because of game usage rights and things like that. Anything new on the Spotify playlist?
As is the case for most of the things that Capcom has put out recently, Ōkami is on Spotify,
Yay.
but Unfinished Swan is not.
Okay. Well, at least Ōkami is. We got something on there new for you this week, but a huge playlist to just listen to all sorts of video game music when you're done listening to our show. And then we'll have bonus tracks coming to you, especially something near the end of the year. Working on that. That should be a nice little project, assuming we can pull that all together. Joe, who are we talking about next week?
I will be talking about Masashi Hamazu.
I will be talking about Martin O'Donnell. Oh, Marty. Games that you have worked on. Who am I talking about? What am I talking about? You'll have to listen to find out. But for now, Joe, let's play us out.
So, as stated before, we like to play out with a remix or a fan cover from YouTube, OC Remix, what have you. Unsurprisingly, not the easiest game to find a remix for. So, I did manage to find one. It is by the YouTube channel Simple Beats by 100. And it's a remix of the Unfinished Swan with some heavy beats added onto it, basically seems to be the main bulk of it. So please enjoy that.
Thank you so much for listening this week on Original Soundchat. We'll see you next time. Take care.